Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Joanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Dr. Ida Meftahi, an assistant professor of the Middle East, specializing in the history of modern Iran with an emphasis on the intersections of politics, gender, and performance. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto's Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations and has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University, as well as visiting assistant professor of contemporary Iranian culture and society at the University of Maryland. She is currently at Boise State University. Her first book, Gender and Dance in Modern Iran, Biopolitics on Stage, received the Association for Iranian Studies prestigious Latife Yarshater Award for its original contribution to the field of Iranian women's studies. She is currently working on her second manuscript, tentatively titled Tulip Grove, Tehran, Urban Geopolitics, Gender, and Performative Culture in Modern Iran, which centers on Tehran's historic Lalezar Street and its surrounding vicinity between 1880 and 1960. So welcome,
Nice.
Dr. Meftahi. How did you find your way to Boise after so many different places on your way here?
Well, I actually graduated from Sharif University of at Tehran, which was a technical university, a very prestigious one in software engineering. But at the same time, I was uh, dancing most of the time, rehearsing dance, and I'll tell the story in a little bit. I became interested in dance performance and gradually started to ask questions about the history of dance. I moved to Canada in 2000, and my biggest goal was to perform and to also find a way to study the history of Iranian dance. So I did my master's at York University in Dance Studies in Toronto, where I wrote a sort of a historical um, dissertation on dance. Most of it was through examination of periodicals, and then I continued my journey after that to University of Toronto's Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations, where I did my PhD. I was also taking courses in performance and theater studies at University of Toronto, and so I did my my PhD thesis there, and then after that, I found a postdoc position at Pennsylvania State University, where I had a chance to sort of um, focus on preparing my book manuscript. And then I found a job at University of Maryland. There I taught mainly courses on Iranian culture and society. So my courses were sort of, ranged from sort of modern history of Iran, which was more of political history, and then I taught Iranian cinema, I taught performance and popular culture. And then after a few years, I found a job and landed a job at Boise State University's Department of History. So here I mostly um, focus on courses that are about the Middle East Islamic civilization, and then I also teach courses on history of modern Iran. Again, my courses are very diverse. I teach courses on cinema, I teach courses on gender studies. I even had a course on sort of performance history of the Middle East, and I also teach, history of modern Middle East. So it's from culture to politics. I do all of that.
And everything in between.
Yes.
So what was it about dancing that first captivated you, that you've made it your lifelong study?
So it's an interesting story and pretty much very unique. I sort of mostly grew up after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So dance was pretty much banned, and most of the cultural stuff was very sort of strict in the first decade of, after the revolution. So I was a very shy girl, and my mother always took me to different classes to find sort of a way to sort of boost my confidence. And among many things, including painting, basketball, volleyball, all of these things, she took me to the dance class of sort of an older ballet teacher in Iran, and she was an Armenian woman who basically was a migrant from the Soviet Union. So I took classes with her. I had, I learned various sort of dances from Russia. I learned Azerbaijani dance, for instance, and so I, or a dance that was called shalakho. And in addition to that, surprisingly, at age 12, I learned some ballroom dances. So sort of cha-cha, waltz, and a couple of these dances, and even a dance that they called mabekir. And so I was studying dance for a while with her, but she was very strict and really didn't help sort of boost my confidence. So I found my mom found another dance teacher who was the sort of the student of Madame Lazarian. And so I stopped for a while, and then my mom found this amazing woman, Farzaneh Kabuli, who was sort of before revolution was Iran's sort of Iranian dance companies. Sort of national dance companies, actually, and she was with that company for I think about like 8 years at least, as a lead dancer, and she was very passionate about dancing. I mean, she was also an actress, so she had to really be careful about her dance classes. But regardless, it was a dance class for women, and then gradually we got opportunities for performance. So during that time, she really worked on sort of new pieces for me, so new choreographies for me that sort of more was more suitable for a shy person. So gradually I started expressing myself through dance, and it sort of became my biggest goal to become a performer. So I would rehearse like hours and hours, sort of the new choreographies. And when during the time that we were performing, mostly in the Italian school in Tehran, and we also had a performance in the Italian embassy in Tehran in late 1990s. Sort of this became an avenue for us to take it more seriously. The performances were for women only, and they were for sort of a charity organization, but just the name of my teacher and her past history as pretty much the star of Iranian national dance brought a lot of audiences. And so we had, I think I was involved with 3 of them, and gradually from having, one solo, I was in 1999, I was involved in sort of pretty much all group dances. They were mostly like folk dances from around Iran. Iran is very diverse culturally, and there are so many diverse folk dances. Then I had, I think, last concert, I had at least 3 or 4 solos. So I became sort of one of her best students. Dancing is very competitive in a way. And then I left to Canada. So at the same time that I was dancing, I was also doing a degree in computer engineering, as I said. But the technical school that I studied in was very strict, very much male dominated. It's not like that anymore. So instead, the dancing world for me was a place to express my feelings. And so when I left Iran, the only goal that I had was to pursue dance and to pursue dance studies.
That's a really remarkable story. And you really are the first person to document the history of dance in Iran. What was that process like, and how is that different from what historians typically do?
Yes, so I have to mention that before I started to do this, Dr. Anthony Shea, who's a very sort of prominent dance scholar, had studied dance, Iranian dance, more through ethnographic methods and more in diaspora. But what I did, first I benefited from the fact that I was already connected to, at least the genre of Iranian dance. And through that, I was also connected to sort of a new sort of genre of theatrical dance, which is called rhythmic movement. So basically, the title of dance is changed to rhythmic movements because dance is, there's always a stigma about dance in at least Muslim countries. So this new theatrical dance in Iran, a lot of the people who initiated that were people like my own dance teacher. So pretty much after I left Iran, they got a chance to stage, these theatrical dances. The themes were mostly like mystical or even religious. So in this genre, pretty much they stage even the history of like early history of Islam through dance, or or the history of Shiism even through dance. Obviously, the dancers are pretty much covered. They're limited in their movements, but they're still dancing. So because of that, I was also connected to that community. And so part of my work was ethnography, but since the work that I started in my MA was sort of a historical examination of the press between 1930 to 1980. That was mostly analysis of the history of dance through whatever that was mentioned or reported in the periodicals of pre-revolutionary time. So I had that background, and I had the other sort of background of being connected to the dance community in Iran. So what I did in my PhD pretty much was a continuation, but in a more serious and analytical way, of the periodicals, government documents, and again, that's the other side was ethnography. So the pretty much one of the most important aspects of my PhD work was to also study cabaret dancing in pre-revolutionary Iran. So this was the cabarets or musical cafes emerged in Iran in mostly in 1950s, and this became a place that this new genre was developed. The audiences, especially in sort of the musical cafes that are called kafe in Persian, it was in a way the audience were mostly men. They would drink alcohol, and so it was more of a restaurant, bar with women performing in them. So the earlier women who started dancing there were most of the time really needy women who didn't have dance training, but there to climb the stage and do such a thing in a Muslim majority country. So they were pretty much very brave also, but it was a good sort of revenue for these performers. So the sort of when Tehran's nightlife expanded, you would see more and more of these women who perform in these settings, and sort of in like parallel to that, Iranian commercial cinema, which is called film Farsi, was being developed. This genre was very much inspired by Egyptian cinema and Indian cinema, and to some extent Hollywood. But one of the central themes in these genres was when the male hero would go to a cafe and get involved with the cafe dancer. So always this story of the dancer was sort of one of the sort of sub stories in the film narrative. So the depiction of cabaret dance became in cinema and on screen became something that was parallel to development of nightlife, mainly in Tehran. So the society also started responding to this genre because it involved many things, including what they perceived as nakedness, nudity, and even prostitution. So I studied both of them, the sort of the lives of these cabaret dancers and their depiction in Iranian cinema, and also the way they, in a way, contributed to economically to Tehran's nightlife and to commercial cinema of Iran, but at the same time they were perceived as prostitutes. So documenting them was the most difficult work that I did in my MA thesis, because when I was using the periodicals of diverse genres, from those that were more about, sort of arts and culture from a nationalist perception, and those with sort of Islamist tendencies, and those with Marxist tendencies. So each of them had their own perception of performance. But when it came to cabaret dancing, they all agreed that this is degeneration, this is sort of it's linked to prostitution. It sort of deceived the youth and sort of takes them out of the ordinary life to basically sort of to be provoked sexually. So they thought that it's creating a disorder in society. So because of all this, it pretty much whatever that was in sort of periodicals about them was very negative, and sort of they created also sort of a myth around the cabaret dancer, that this was a needy woman who was a runaway girl, who was sort of tricked by sort of a man to come to Tehran, for instance, and then she ended up in sort of the red light district of Tehran, and then found an opportunity to go on stage and dance, but still they were involved with the male audiences. So a lot of these things were also projected in the periodicals. So and the same story was about the sort of the character type of dancer prostitute on screen. So sort of deconstructing this was really, really difficult. So I really needed to get connected to actual cabaret dancers. So pretty much, I could calculate that these people would be older and not very much visible in society, because after the revolution, cabarets were burnt down, and also many cinemas that would show sort of popular cinema were also burnt down. So many of these women also denied their past. In a way, they wanted to forget their own histories. So finally, I was able to get connected to one woman who was really amazing, and then she also connected me to another lady who was older, and she passed away really a few months after I interviewed her. So when I met them, my whole worldview changed, because I, as a dancer, also associated with high culture, I always had my own perception of these women. But then hearing their life stories as not only cabaret dancers, but sort of um, actors who did sort of improvised comedy in Lalazar Street most of the time. And like the other parts of their lives was really interesting. It was really eye-opening. And then I was able to sort of connect the dots of what was perceived publicly and their actual life. Then I was able to find another actress, actually two actresses in Toronto. They were living in senior houses in Toronto, and again, I was able to find another star of sort of cabaret and also films, again, commercial cinema. So one thing that all of them asked me to do was not to reveal their names, their actual names, mainly because their families were concerned. So I can tell that one of these ladies, her daughter uh, was a cinema sort of actress, pretty much famous in post-revolutionary Iran, and the other had a very famous daughter singer. But all of them wanted to sort of they wanted to give me information because they were happy that someone cared about them, but at the same time they weren't comfortable even telling their kids that we did the interview. So I interviewed these ladies for, I think I recorded, especially the ones in Iran, I think I have at least 15 hours of recording with them. And so that became really useful in analyzing their history. And then I was able to find sort of government documents about the nightlife of Iran and also about prostitution. So the whole idea of prostitution for cabaret dancers was sort of this convention in Iranian cabarets, and it's very similar to um, you know the convention in Egyptian cabarets at that time in 1960s and 70s, was that when the dancers in the middle of their performance would come to you know the space that women that their male audiences were sitting, and they would just basically sort of make eye contacts with them, and then after the performance these male audiences, some of them would want to drink with them, and this was through the cabaret owner. So this was pretty much a hidden type of prostitution. I mean, this could be, but the cabaret owner was the one who sort of even sold tickets to these male audiences, and then asked the women, the performers, to sit with these guys on their table and drink. But this sort of implied that after the show, they would go out with these men. But most of the time, because they had to drink with several of them, there were fights outside of the cabaret, and it was so risky that many of them would carry cold weapons. So this was basically the type of, in a way, sort of secretive prostitution in areas that were that such sort of conduct was pretty much banned by the city police. I mean, red light district of Tehran, it was okay to do these things, but places like Lalazar, for instance, they had to in a way follow the rules of the city and the city police. So for that reason, I was able to find sort of the cabaret dancers in the footnotes of a book about prostitution in Iran. And also through that, I was able to analyze some of these, again, government documents about prostitutions, their limitations, and also the way that cabaret dancers and sort of what they call workers of the nightlife had to follow. For instance, as my interviews also mentioned, they had to take sort of STD tests every 6 months to be able to get permission for their performances. So it was a very complicated story, but I was really lucky to connect to people who actually talked about these things. So that was all my story about, sort of studying this thing that was really untouched. I mean, even in sort of historical narratives, even for the people who were writing about gender and sexual history of Iran, still they had this perception that these women were not worthy of their study. There were a bunch of prostitutes, but not even prostitutes that were considered, legitimate enough. There were studies of, for instance, red light district of Tehran, but not these people. So bringing their lives into history, in addition to the other things, was really challenging, but I think that's really fulfilling. I mean, it made me change my perceptions about sort of different people with different problems and also exciting stories.
That's really interesting that you discovered this whole segment of Tehran of women that were being ignored. When you are researching now, Lalezar Street, are you finding a lot of more stories of people that have been under the radar and not brought into history, as you said?
Yes, I mean, one of the most interesting things about my previous research, and especially being involved with these cabaret women, was that most of these, for instance, dance genres were developed in theaters of Lalezar Street since early 20th century. So there were sort of these more upper class audiences who would go to operettas about sort of Iranian nationalism, but they had performers in them, mostly from like emigres with non-Muslim background. So most of these things were actually developed in Lalezar Street. So I had a lot of background about this area and its culture. But what I didn't know was that most of these performances were happening in an area that's mostly considered a place for development of cosmopolitan culture of Iran. Lalezar is also compared to Broadway or Champs-Élysées. It was called Champs-Élysées of Tehran, especially in early 1900. But then I realized when I did more study and archival research that because Lalazar Street was in a very strategic place in Tehran, it was basically the neighboring street was the street that was called earlier the street of European embassies. So when Lalazar was being developed since late 19th century, these streets were also being developed. So first, I think French embassy moved there, and then gradually the British embassy, the sort of the legation of Netherlands, Turkey, Austria, Germany, all moved there. And many of the people who came to work in these embassies, their families started, basically opening various types of shops. For instance, there were liquor stores, there were gambling houses, there were drug stores, boutiques, and sort of even one hotel that was called Paris Hotel. All of these started there, and one major hotel that was started there that it's most of the time very present in Iranian sort of cultural memory was called Grand Hotel. So this was a place that not only immigrants from Russian Empire or Soviet Union, and also the immigrants who escaped sort of persecution in Ottoman Empire or Turkey, many of them would come to this street and intermingle with these also sort of foreigners who came for the embassies, and also sort of upper class Iranians who had their own, let's say, print shops there. So in this venue, this in a way, this was a hub for cosmopolitan cultural production, sort of modernity, and pretty much all the turning points of 20th century Iran, you can see that it was sort of had an impact and a sort of very clear reflection in this area. And I have to say that the Parliament of Iran and some of the major offices were also in the street. So it was very, very, in a way, an important urban sort of hub for not only cultural development, but for geopolitics. So you can see this area during the Iranian constitutional revolution when, the British or the Russians got involved. So, you would see people interacting with them, or even, taking refuge in these embassies. Then again, during World War, you can see that the famine that after the, Allies' occupation of Iran, happened around the country. People in this area also suffered from famine, and there were bread riots there. Then again, World War II, sort of again Allies' occupation of Iran. You would see many clashes between sort of drunken Allied soldiers with Iranians. There were even like abduction of women, or even rape. So you would see sort of also the relationship of Iranian government with these sort of foreign embassies. Another really important turning point that exactly happened in this Lalazar district and its surrounding area was the sort of Anglo-American coup d'etat of 1953. Many of the riots and demonstrations happened there, and for instance, during the coup, since a lot of the communist press had offices in this neighborhood, actually sort of across from the Soviet embassy. During the coup, many of them were burned down. So you would see a lot of these sort of destructions that came because of politics and even international politics. It have a direct impact in Lalazar Street. And as I said, like 1979 revolution, also you would see, places being burned down. So it's not just, a place for culture or sort of fashion or many of these things that are perceived to be, but also a place that you can, in a way, study urban geopolitics. The fact that it was called, for instance, Champs-Élysées of Tehran, it was because the French culture was very much present in this neighborhood. Missionary schools, for instance, they were exactly French missionary schools in Lalazar Street. So it was French culture, French language, which was also lingua franca of Iran back then. All were present. So the fashion, for instance, the French fashion was very much around. So it's, whatever that was around the world, that was a practice that was fashionable around the world, you would see that happening there. Again, ballroom dancing of various types, or for instance, World War II, American soldiers would dance with Iranian women, which of course, created a lot of negative response in the society, because it was a few years after unveiling of women in 1937 by Reza Shah. So imagine that from 1937 unveiling of women to 1941 World War. Iranian women would engage or dance in the arms of foreign soldiers. So exactly like the dance craze of 1940s was present in that area. So it's a fascinating place to really study a lot of things. So it's a very complicated story again, and it needed me to really, more than anything, rely on sort of diplomatic documents. So I've done archival work at the National Archive, British National Archive, which is a fascinating archive. Then I've done work in a lot of sort of archival research at the National Archive here, which is again very fascinating. That was the National Archive was in Maryland, so it was very close to the university. And then, of course, a wide range of archives in Iran. And archives actually in Iran are very, very sort of developed. You can basically order documents and get it on a CD. This is not the case with the British or American archive. So there I have worked in, and also I sort of hired research assistants who had done a lot of work on retrieving and also documenting and indexing these sort of archival sources. So there you can sort of, sort of cross-examine the correspondences, let's say, between Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the British legation, or the American legation. These became the legations changed to embassies after sort of the Tehran conference, where Churchill, Stalin, and President Roosevelt met in pretty much Lalazar Street. So you can see these correspondences, and you can see the real life of Iranians, and you can see its reflection in these sort of diplomatic documents. And then you can see that how each of these are responding to each other. You can see that, for instance, British legation knew that their, the behavior of their drunken soldiers are destructive. But then when responding to sort of Ministry of Foreign Affairs that wanted sort of justice for Iranian citizens, they would deny everything. But in documents, you can see that they actually knew what's happening, but they didn't want to take responsibility for sometimes financial reasons. So
you describe you describe your work like you are a detective or an investigator.
Exactly.
More than what we think of as a historian.
Yes, and I love that.
Of course.
I love that, really. And again, this is, I mean, unlike my, sort of previous work on dance, that was very much about sort of local or national sort of sphere of Iran. This is much more international. So it's a connection between sort of international relations and sort of national politics and cultural development. So, and actually everyday life of Iranians. So it's kind of a also bottom up history as well. It's not about always, how the government of Iran ruled people, but also about everyday life on streets and the response of people to, international politics or national politics.
It sounds like students at Boise State are really lucky to have you and to be able to take one of your classes.
Yes, I mean, I'm really excited for being here at Boise State. I mean, first of all, I found Boise really a really amazing place. I mean, there's so many stereotypes about Idaho, but Boise is really fascinating. It's a clean city with really nice people and a lot of nature. I feel that people are really down to earth here and very cultured, and I see the same thing in my students and also colleagues. Most of the time my students come to class with sort of an open mind to learn about an area that they don't know much about. So they engage with the courses and they engage with the material and also with myself. And I think for them, I'm also sort of in a way, an unusual type of instructor. Um, but yeah, I really love being here.
Are there things that you wish your students or maybe Americans in general understood better about Iran?
Yes, I mean, about Iran, I'm pretty much, I mean, obviously, I'm much more passionate about culture, society, and also politics. So I want, first of all, I ask my students to pronounce Iran the right way and not Iran. And
So
so
step one, pronounce it correctly.
pronunciation, I always say, like, repeat after me, it's Iran. And then, I mean, uh, yeah, to view Iran also outside of or beyond international politics. I mean, even Iranian national politics is very different than what people would view. So uh, to understand the cultural history of Iran, uh, the social history of Iran, and also present. Really, it's not all about like past, but also present. I mean, as I talked about, sort of the cosmopolitan culture of Iran, uh, you know, in early 20th century and or throughout 20th century, Iranian culture is very cosmopolitan. I mean, it's true that, uh, whatever, we have all these history of Persian Empire or, Islamic conquest and, Iranians becoming Muslim and then development of Shiism versus um, sort of Sunnism. So all of these are there, but also there is this cosmopolitan culture. Iranians are very much aware of, let's say, American culture. They speak English very well, um, thanks to satellite and internet, and Hollywood. They know very much about what's going on in United States or other parts of the world, um, and they watch things and they learn from that. So we see for instance, post-revolutionary Iranian cinema that was supposed to die after that sort of disruptive conditions of 1979 revolution. But we see sort of an organic national cinema that was developed in Iran that it's very much connected to the world culture, but it's authentic. And you would see Iranian filmmakers receiving international awards pretty much once in a while. um, and that is very much sort of really representative of you know the diversity and also the open-mindedness of Iranians. And the other thing, the difference between public and private life. This is a very sort of in a way, a very Iranian thing, but also a Middle Eastern thing, because because of Islamic regulations, and even Islamic sort of social uh, rules. Um, there was always a difference between how people live their private lives with public lives. So, for instance, especially with women, historically, uh, inside the house was a safe space for them that they could live a life, but outside they had to cover their uh, themselves and had limited interaction with men. Of course, that has changed, and especially after revolution, you would see much more presence of women outside the world, outside the houses, in workplace, in universities, even in whatever sport competitions and all that. But the difference between private life and public life still exists. So that's another thing. I mean, in public, in Islamic countries, people may uh, be limited, but inside the houses, there are parties and drinking and all that.
Ida, Dr. Meftahi, it's been so great to talk to you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And we really appreciate and value the work that you do at Boise State. And we're lucky to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the interview.